The Fractal Design Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic is pretty much the same CPU cooler as the Fractal Design Celsius Plus S24 Prisma. The only differences between these two models is the fan used. And of course, the price. The Fractal Design Celsius S24 Dynamic has little to no RGB integration, with the only RGB LEDs present on this cooler are on the CPU water block. The Fractal Design Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic is based on the 6th generation acetic pump and loop systems. However, it uses Fractal Design fans and has some unique features that make it stand out from the crowd. The Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic is available for around $132 US, which is approximately $30 US cheaper than the S24 Prisma, which can be acquired right now for $163 US. Keep in mind that the prices are at the moment of this review, so don't quote me about them 1 year later. And what is this price difference all about, you say? Easy. RGB. Well, the fans on the S24 Dynamic are said to be delivering slightly less performance, but we shall see about that when we test the CPU cooler. The S24 Dynamic uses a standard 240mm radiator which can accommodate up to 4 120mm fans. That's 2 120mm fans on each side for a push-pull configuration. By default, this CPU cooler has a push configuration. This radiator has a length of 284mm, a width of 122mm and a thickness of 31mm. One good feature present on this radiator is this little fan hub that can also pass on the RGB signal. This hub has a total of 4 fan connectors and 2 3-pin addressable RGB headers. From the factory, one of the fan headers is already used by the pump of the water block. This is a great little thing to have, as it will massively reduce the cable mess you can easily get into in your system. The water block of the S24 Dynamic is identical with the one used on the S24 Prisma. Both water blocks have the pump of the cooler integrated inside, and both have a ring of RGB LEDs. However, if you do not connect the RGB connector of the block, then the LEDs will power on and have a solid white color. The top part of the CPU block has a matte surface and will not reflect anything. In fact, nothing shows up on this matte side unless the water block is powered on. The CPU block has a height of just 45mm and a diameter of 62mm, which makes it smaller than the average acetic-based CPU cooler. This water block has some unique features. First, the top part of the block has an auto ring which can be rotated. This is actually the switch that cycles between the auto operating mode or the PWM mode. This PWM mode means that you can either control the pump speed through your motherboard or just have it work at its maximum speed all the time. These modes are displayed on the edge of the matte finish in a subtle white font. The base plate of the cooler is made from solid copper and has a nice linear brushed texture. This cooler also comes with a pre-applied layer of thermal compound. Unfortunately, this copper-made base plate is attached to the plastic casing of the pump with no less than 8 torque screws, which is quite unfortunate as many other coolers are pushing for no screws on the base plate surface. The tubes of the S24 Dynamic have a length of 400mm and are covered by high-quality synthetic sleeving. These tubes are flexible enough to make the installation process easy. In addition, the tubes are connected to the radiator with the standard plastic fittings and with 90 degrees angle fittings on the CPU block. These angle fittings are made from plastic but can also swivel and further aid with the installation process. The 2 fans included with the S24 Dynamic are part of the Dynamic X2 series. The actual model of the fans is the Dynamic X2 GP12 PWM. These fans have no RGB and will spin at a maximum speed of 2000 RPM with the minimum speed being at 500 RPM. In addition, these fans use what Fractal Design calls LLS type bearing system and have a rating for lifespan of 100,000 hours. Thankfully, both fans are powered through the standard 4-pin connector and are fully PWM compatible, thus you can control them through your motherboard. Before we test the cooler, it's time to see what is included with it, and we start with a user manual, a plastic made backplate, a metallic bracket for installing the cooler in an AMD system, 4 metal thumb screws, 8 metal fan screws, 8 metal short screws for mounting the radiator inside your case, and 2 sets of double-threaded screws for Intel and AMD platforms. You also get a 5V addressable RGB cable, an AMD mounting standoff, a set of washers, and 2 cable clips for wire management. The installation of this cooler is very simple, and it is identical with not only the Celsius Plus S24 Prisma, but with all acetic-based CPU coolers. First, you place the backplate at the back of the CPU socket, then you install the correct double-sided screws in them. Afterwards, you place the CPU block over the studs and CPU and secure it with these large metal-made thumb screws. And that's pretty much it. You are done. Of course, you also have to install the radiator and the fans, but that's up to you and what your case can accommodate. And this is how the Fractal Design Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic looks like installed in my testing system. Quite good, especially that white ring of lights on the CPU block. The clearance is great, obviously, and the tubes are flexible enough to not create issues with the rest of the system. Before we test the CPU cooler, you will get to hear a noise sample of both the pump running in 2 operating modes and the fans spinning up and down from their lowest RPM to their maximum RPM. I am doing this because while a decibel value is useful to compare the CPU coolers, it does not take into account external sound sources, such as bearing ticking on the pump and the fans, and vibrations being passed on into the system. And we start with the pump and its 2 modes of operation. With the 2 fans spinning at a maximum speed of 2000 RPM, the Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic reached a maximum noise output of 46 decibels, with the measuring device placed at a distance of 10 cm away from the system and the CPU cooler. This places the Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic 1 decibel behind the Celsius Plus S24 Prisma. This noise output is high. However, the actual noise generated by the fan is nothing but the sound of air being pushed into the radiator, which is much better than what other coolers are offering these days. The cooler is tested using the Intel i9 9900K CPU running at both its factory frequency and settings, and then overclocked manually to 5 GHz on all cores. The first test uses the Intel Burn Test V2 benchmark, a synthetic benchmark which places a load onto the CPU that is similar with what you can get when playing a modern AAA video game. And in this test, the Fractal Design Celsius S24 Dynamic reached a maximum temperature of 57 degrees Celsius with the CPU overclocked to 5 GHz and 53 degrees Celsius with the CPU running at its factory settings. This places the Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic right next to the Celsius Plus S24 Prisma, and 1 degree between the 2 CPU coolers is quite small. However, the next test is where each CPU cooler is pushed to its limits, some even beyond that, as this test uses the system stability test of the S24 Extreme software. This synthetic benchmark places an unrealistically high load on the CPU, something which you will rarely if ever encounter in your daily usage. The only way you can get close to this level of CPU load is if you are doing heavy video rendering with the CPU as the only rendering unit. And in this test, the Fractal Design Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic reached a maximum temperature of 82 degrees Celsius, with the CPU overclocked to 5 GHz on all cores, and a temperature of 59 degrees Celsius with the CPU running at its factory settings and frequency. Basically identical with the Celsius Plus S24 Prisma. However, this temperature is achieved with the pump running in PWM mode, thus at its maximum speed. If we switch to auto mode and allow the pump speed to lower, then the temperature will increase to 89 degrees Celsius with the CPU overclocked to 5 GHz on all cores. Not that great, especially with the high noise output of the fans. The Fractal Design Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic, much like the Fractal Design Celsius Plus S24 Prisma, is a great all-in-one liquid CPU cooler that has a few tricks up its sleeve. The adjustable operating mode for the pump is different, however it will severely affect the cooling performance of this cooler. Another thing about this cooler is the included fan hub, which will greatly improve the cable management in the system. The Celsius Plus S24 Dynamic performs almost the same as the Celsius Plus S24 Prisma, give or take 1 degree in certain situations. And seeing this, how can the price difference between the Prisma and the Dynamic be justified? Well, it's simple. RGB and slightly less noise. With the Prisma model, you will pay more for having a prettier CPU cooler, while with the Dynamic, you pay less for having more or less the same cooling performance but no RGB on the fans. The choice is up to you, but I'd always get the Dynamic as it's cheaper and has the same performance. The build quality of this CPU cooler is very good, even though the plastic is used too much to be completely honest, especially around the CPU block. The installation procedure is very easy thanks to a mounting system that is being used by half the CPU coolers on the market right now. All you need to do right now is to decide if the noise of the pump is something you can live with, as honestly I wouldn't use the auto mode at all. The performance hit is too much, especially at this price point. If you like this review, then you might consider subscribing for more, and also if you want to support me in a direct way, then in the description below you will find the links for both the Patreon and the subscriber star pages of this channel.